Esteemed candidate, you confront a committee which was appointed by the Council of Deans and that is charged with the task of examining both your dissertation and the propositions submitted therewith. Professor Laws, who is Professor of Music at the Music in School of Arts and Creative Technologies at the University of York in Britain, whom we welcome here, will open the discussion. The floor is yours.
Esteemed candidate? Is it? Sounds like I might be too loud. Is it okay? Oh, yeah, okay. Esteemed candidate, thank you very much for your work and the possibility to engage with it. I've enjoyed it very much. I have a first question, which I'm going to go straight into. So, in your PhD, you write about how you can use dramatic gestures to, and I quote you, summon, signal, or prepare silences. And you demonstrate these things very clearly through a whole range of different examples. But I wonder if you could talk to me about how the gestures influence or change what the audience hears in the silence, and perhaps with a couple of examples, because I suspect that the answer will be different for different kinds of work.
Hooggeleerde opponents. The question refers to the ways in which gestures can summon, signal, or prepare silences. How does this affect the audience? I will start with a caveat saying that I have not addressed this directly in the dissertation. It was a choice, a conscious choice, to focus on the presentation of the silences by the performer. However, that does not mean the question does not interest me a great deal. I am writing an article for the University of Nancy in France, which is called "The Audience Grows Restless." And in this text, I try to address the question of how do audiences respond to the John Cage 4 minutes and 33 composition, 4.5 minutes of silence. The audience has a tendency, and this is something that has been discussed quite a lot, especially by the critic Kahn, that the audience has a tendency, Douglas Kahn, in his Noise, Water, Meat, that he discusses why the audience tends to react so badly to performances of this piece, a piece which, in theory, is about respectful silence, but which often devolves into a situation in which one or two audience members become upset and leave the hall, or do something else to indicate their anger with the situation. So it's a paradoxical situation in which silence is not so much listened to as imposed, or at least it is interpreted that way by the audience. So that is an extreme case in which silence leads to other things which turn out often to be noise. The audience does not always grow restless. If you give a performance of the Beethoven's Last Piano Sonata, Opus 111, the performer can produce many, many gestures, and I speak particularly about, for example, Sviatoslav Richter and his reverse boxer. We spoke about that the other day. I also give the example of Katie Mahan, who has these beautiful balletic gestures that she does. How does the audience perceive and interpret those gestures? The performer is motivated to summon silence, to shape the silence with these large, often extravagant gestures. But does the audience perceive them the same way? And I would argue no. I would argue that the audience has a very selective perception, and that many people may not necessarily, sitting in the audience, be even aware of the gestures as themselves constituting a possible language of signs. They may be sitting back, enjoying the concert in a more passive way. However, there may also be more active listeners who do focus on the gestures and who are looking, engaging with the silence visually, and trying to understand the interpretation. Some performers particularly try to emphasize their connection with the audience through overly dramatic gestures. Think of Evgeny Kissin, extremely popular pianist. He has a tendency, after the first fanfare in Opus 111, to withdraw his hand in what I call the dentist, a kind of a clutching, grabbing gesture, which sounds comical now, but if you see it on stage, it's almost frightening. It has an ability to draw in the audience. So those might be some of the ways in which the audience reacts to what the performer is expressing. But I do not think there's a one-to-one correlation between the intentions of the performer or the motivations, the word I use in my dissertation, and the actual experience of the audience members.
Thank you. I completely agree in terms of the relationship between performer intention and audience reception being by no means aligned. And I also agree with your determination to think about this from the performer perspective, and not to, I completely agree and understand why this is not a study of audience perception. At the same time, I think as performers, however much we are focused on what we are doing, we always have hopes or ideas about what we think we are providing to an audience. And of course, we do that all the time musically. But when you start to think about gesture in the concrete way that you have, actually not just acknowledging that you will be making gestures as a performer, as we all do, but that you're going to some extent, make choices about what kinds of gestures you will make. Presumably, well, I suppose this is the question, is that the same as the kinds of decisions you make about, for example, touch, tone, weighting of sounds? And in that case, you surely do have a kind of intentionality about what you think you are inviting the audience, or what your gestures might afford the audiences in terms of what they hear in the spaces. I wonder whether that clarifies the question a little bit more.
Can you give a short answer?
I will. I believe we are in almost total agreement about the performer's gestures and this search of a motivation by using gestures that will communicate to the audience, communicate our own intentions as, in our particular case, pianists, but generally as musicians. So the question of intentionality, I think there is no doubt. The gestures are performed with intentionality. Whether the audience receives them in the same way as we as performers intend them is difficult to measure, but maybe food for further thought in my next dissertation, in my next project, let's say.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Laws. The examination shall be continued by Professor de Groot from the University of Amsterdam, whom we welcome to these proceedings.
Thank you very much. Esteemed candidate, first of all, my compliments with your dissertation, which I read with great joy. You have done justice to the multiple dimensions of performing silence in music by integrating a variety of methods of approach in a non-dogmatic way. You paid due attention to the changes in your own performing and teaching practices. And your work gives an excellent account of your interaction with students. So your dissertation fully deserves the qualification of artistic research. Now my question. I'd like to dwell for a moment on the final moments in the Ninth Symphony of Gustav Mahler, the Adagio. It's a long, drawn-out process of increasing silence and also slowing down tempo. At least 5 different means of musical means he uses to effect this. And I mentioned them briefly. One is the fragmentation of the orchestral sound, the presentation of isolated melodic segments surrounded by arrests. 2, melodic immobility. Instead of melodic movements, there are tones that are held for a long time, immobilizing. 3, fermate over the bar line, which necessitates the conductor to stop conducting for a moment. 4, general pauses for the whole orchestra. And 5, a fermate over the final pitch with the prescription dying out, aussterben. I'd like to ask you to reflect on these different means of silencing, of silence taking place in the place of sound, according to your theories of your dissertation. And I briefly repeat the means: fragmentation of the orchestral sound, melodic immobility, fermate over the bar line, general pauses for the whole orchestra, and fermate over the final pitch with the instruction of dying out.
Hooggeleerde opponents. The question is a rather technical one, but I admire this composition for exactly the elements you describe, and you have broken it down very precisely, explaining why those silences and the silence created by the end of the symphony becomes so powerful. Interestingly enough, Mahler was one of the composers at the end of the 19th century who was most vocally advocating for a silence of decorum, an audience silence, because he wanted his music to be listened to carefully and in silence. So we know that these 5, among potentially other methods of creating a silent situation, were important to him and that he wanted them to be perceived by the listener. By isolating segments, he does something which refers perhaps, or which I can describe through Richard C. Littlefield's discussion of framing. This is something I address in chapter 2. I talk about how silence can frame a work of art, but as Littlefield also suggests, the work of art can frame the silences. The melodic immobility is something that you heard in several of the pieces I performed on Sunday, in which, for example, the melodic immobility of Louis Anderson's very tiny piece, not an enfant, in which almost nothing is happening, creates a situation in which we, as audience members, are pulled into a slower, more peaceful world. The fermata over the bar line is a technique which is echoed today in many other composers, and in my own particular concert is echoed by George Crumb, who uses exactly the same notation in the Macrocosmos, although not the Macrocosmos that I performed on Sunday, but another one. So that is a technique that he likes to use, a notational technique. And the Gran Pausa goes back to the question of isolated segments. The Gran Pausa of the whole orchestra stopping. As this happens, the audience is also put potentially into one of those awkward silences, where there is an uncertainty about, is this the end? Where is the end? And so, by using these various techniques, Mahler is doing exactly what you say. He's bringing us into the end of his last symphony. And of course, there's a reference to death. There's no question about that. It is this sadness of silence that is, I believe, made possible by these different notational and compositional techniques.
Thank you very much. Do you also envisage alternatives for performance?
Keep it short, please. Keep it short, please.
Yeah. Like the ending of the symphony, there are different ways of performing I've seen. For instance, some conductors like Bernstein stop performing as soon as the sound has died out. But Claudio Abbado keeps conducting after the sound has and entered into silence for many long moments. So are there alternatives, in your opinion, of performing this silencing process?
I believe there are always alternatives. And of course, Bernstein, I'm not surprised. He would probably go for something like that, a more controversial approach. Abato would go for perhaps a more romantic approach. I think I have to keep this short. Yes, there are always alternatives. The performer has a great deal of agency in these situations, I believe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor de Groot. The discussion or examination shall be continued by Ms. Plateau.
Esteemed candidate, thank you very much for your thesis. It was very interesting. And I was particularly interested by the noisy archive, the concept of the archive of silences that you have started. And I was wondering whether you intend to elaborate on this once in the near future, but also what are the criteria that you used, in fact, to introduce particular silences in gesture, in notation, in sound, obviously, to introduce them into this encyclopedic, I could say, enumeration, and whether it is possible to also add descriptive criteria as to the quality, and could there be a ranking? So maybe an elaborate question, but I'm very interested in how you perceive the concept of this archive. Thank you.
Wel edelgeleerde opponents. The noisy archive is actually an archive of silence, but it became known as the noisy archive in the process of my work with my supervisors because one discovered so many noisy elements around the silences. The noisy archive is also noisy in the sense that it is unfinished. It is itself a work in progress. And although it is codified in the dissertation and now printed, and you can get a copy and it's physical, that tangibility is only temporary. For me, the real version lives on the research catalog where it is potentially expandable. I have actually many, many more examples, and it was difficult to make the decisions about which examples would go into the archive. The question about quality and ranking is one I would prefer to avoid, to be honest. I may have my own personal opinions about the silences and the situations that I find most appealing, but I try to avoid remarking on that in the context of the dissertation. However, when I perform these live for a public, I often share my own personal thoughts, and I do rank, oh, this is a really powerful silence. The necessity in the archive was to make choices which would demonstrate 4 or 5 different, let's say, categories of silence, ranging, stretching, let's say, because I did indeed stretch quite a bit definitions of silence, ranging from notated, very official sort of classical silences through to the end of the archive, which goes into questions of silencing, of racism, of things being silenced, performers being silenced, non-notated silences, meta-silences, silences where a silence occurs without being announced or written in a score. So it is a very broad definition of silence, and I plan to enlarge the archive now with further examples as I continue.
And would it also be an idea to make it open source so that the intersubjectivity of silence, that the audience can add to that as well, or would that be?
In fact, I plan to do that. Yes.
Looking forward
Very
to that.
much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Plateau. The discussion shall be continued by Professor Beckles-Wilson from the Leiden University and Codas Rotterdam. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Esteemed candidate, congratulations on your very stimulating research and also the way you've presented it combining text and video and audio. I enjoyed it a lot. Much of your discussion, I noticed, relates to your work as a soloist on the instrument. And this isn't a question with one answer, but I'm inviting you to reflect on a slightly different position. I wonder how rethinking the piano as a shared instrument, as in piano for hands, would shift your experiences and your reflections. There's a physical intimacy to consider in this case, involving the many sounds of the other person right beside you. And there are extra senses too, most obviously tactility, touching one another. In some repertoire, there's a hands crossing each other. There's an overlaying of hands. And I think that there are often a lot of gestures that help the players communicate to one another, but they're hidden from the audience. And those gestures are a language that has its own silence in that respect. It's not for the audiences, it's for the performers. And it's very potent. So I wonder if you could just reflect on this different position when you're sharing the keyboard with somebody else.
Hooggeleerde opponents, thank you for this question, which broadens the potential of the archive. To reflect briefly on why it is mostly solo works, it was a decision that we made consciously in order to deal with first COVID and the isolation thereby imposed. I ended up doing most of my research in my studio by myself. But also, it was a decision from the point of view of artistic research to try to focus on those pieces with which I had the most personal experience, both on stage and in the practice room. Nonetheless, I'm fully aware that the archive is thus limited, and that harks back to the question previously, how will it expand? And it will expand into works of other composers and works involving other formations. Now, the intimacy and the shared tactility of piano for hands, I think I could illustrate that with a composition that I've performed with someone in this room. The composition by Maaike Nas, which she's a Dutch composer, and this work involves two pianists sitting at the piano, and as they sit at the piano, they both play notes, mostly clusters, but also do clapping and interactive physical gestures with each other. So they're sitting as close as Ned and I, and stand for a second, and they...
Can you talk in the microphone and so the parent?
Okay, well, the demonstration, but anyway, you get the idea. So the point is that it is a very close and interactive situation. Now, in that case, it is a different kind of intimacy. It's the intimacy of not screwing up because you have to get all the claps right. It goes extremely fast. Another example would be, of course, involving more silence than the Nas. Oh, the Nas involves silences at the times when you don't clap, there are sudden pauses. And those pauses, if you miss them, if one performer misses them, then you don't have the effect. One could look at the Ravel Ma Mère Loi, four hands piece, which is extremely still and peaceful. In that, there's a different kind of intimacy. And in order to get the cues right between the two performers, you need to have a shared breathing, a shared technique, a shared gestural and physical approach to the piano. So all those could be part of an extended archive, a further noisy, less noisy, more noisy archive, which may be in the future.
Thank you. I'll go on to another question. As you know, I've crossed between life as a pianist in the Western classical tradition into performing on the oud in modal traditions of West Asia, where the spontaneous creation of melody, which is sometimes called improvisation, is very important. And there, the role of silence is really undisputed. The role of silence is in shaping the sound, but also in leaving space for the audience to express their pleasure and just pacing. Now, I might say that this isn't really improvisation, but in a way it is. It's kind of improvising with silence. Now, when you play pre-composed works, you are also responding in certain ways to the types of silence that emerge. It's not all fixed, even though there's a fixed composition, of course. There's a lot of spontaneity. And I wonder, would you go as far as saying that you are also improvising with silences in your performances? Or would you characterize that as a form of interpretation? In which case, what are you interpreting?
How much time do we have for this question? It's a very tricky question. To what extent are we improvising on stage? And in my case, a great deal perhaps. Is that my interpretation? Is that what interpretation means? And you could make many different arguments in many different directions. I'll just stick with my own personal experience here to say that, yes, I am improvising to a certain extent. There are pieces, for example, from my concert on Sunday, pieces in which I extend the silences, feeling or trying to feel the audience reaction. My ear is going out during the silences, flying around the audience, checking people's mood, their experience, and coming back to me and saying, make that a little longer, make that a little shorter. There are other situations in which you don't have that luxury, if it is a luxury. I believe it is. I would say I'm a rather free interpreter, so that this sort of improvisatory spontaneity comes maybe naturally to me, and I feel comfortable with that. I have not improvised in, for example, the styles of other cultures, so I only know, let's say, Western European improvisation. So I come from that angle, which is a limited one, I realize. So what I hear and what I consider to be improvisation would not be, in other situations, considered improvisation, but I believe that in my case, there is a direct relationship between interpretation and improvisation.
Thanks very much for your responses.
Thank you so much, Professor Beckles-Wilson. The examination shall be continued by Professor Barrett.
Esteemed candidate, it's interesting that we should have moved on to the question of improvisation now, because that's something I would like to continue with. One of the most valuable concepts in this extremely valuable research output that you have is the concept of the marker of silence. And reading your very thorough examination of that concept, the thought spontaneously occurred to me, well, what about unmarked silences? What happens then? And so my mind was taken to what happens in a free group improvisation, for instance, which is not based on a score or a tradition, where a silence occurs. It can very often happen that nobody in the room, neither the musicians nor the audience, know whether or not that's a silence which finishes a composition or whether the music is going to start again. In my experience, sometimes it seems that the audience decides whether the music has ended, and sometimes the musicians decide whether the music has ended by marking the silence in some way, perhaps by relaxing their hold on their instrument. I wonder if you could comment on what kind of process you think is going on in a situation like that, where nobody knows what the silence is for.
Hooggeleerde opponents. Indeed, this is a nice continuation. I'm not a professional improviser, but I am involved in the improvisation world peripherally. I go to a great many concerts where there is improvisation, and this effect of silence potentially signifying the end of the performance or the end of the piece or the end of the tune is a common one. And indeed, that's often used as the marker for the end of the work. So I took improvisation lessons from a performer in Paris many years ago, and he had an insistence on never allowing silence. He said, you must always be creating sound. You must never let it die. And this was like a mantra for him. And Frederic Blondy, that is also his personal style. He has a very frenetic manner of improvising. But there are other ways, obviously. The performer Dan Warburton, also in Paris, worked with very, very soft sounds, and it was very easy in his performances for the audience to decide that it was over, whereas the piece was still going on. And Dan would just continue performing. And at some point, the audience would, oh yeah, okay, go back to our seats. With my colleague Ned here, we have discussed various different ways of improvising silence. We have not come to any useful conclusions yet because it is so difficult. Without having something written down, the silence almost always seems to imply the death of the piece, which is a kind of weird reworking of Georges Bataille's quote, that silence is a slippery word which implies its own death. Now, Bataille is meaning that by saying something in a silence, you break the silence, therefore you're killing the word, and it disappears, so that silence implies its own non-existence, or it defeats itself. But this is a kind of another situation where silence implies the defeat or the death of the performance. So I don't have a good answer to that question, but it would be worth pursuing, maybe using gestures between the performers to communicate when silence was desirable, but somehow also possibly having a language of gestures that was shared with the audience so that the audience could participate in this and be part of the process.
Thank you very much. Okay. Do I have time to ask something else? Yes. Another example that came to my mind regarding unmarked silences took me back to a remark that a composer of electronic music once made to me. And he said that one of the reasons why he liked making fixed media electronic music was that nobody can ever tell what's going to happen next. So if there's a silence, there is no marker to tell you how long it will last, or indeed whether the music is finished or not. And this is, I don't believe, something that you address explicitly in your thesis. And yes, I spent a lot of time thinking about this comment, that this is something attractive about the fact that you, if the sound stops, you don't know how loud it's going to be when it comes back or if it's going to come back. And yes, I was wondering whether you had some comment on that situation as well.
Thank you. I think the best thing I could do would be to refer it back to the John Cage performance at the end of my concert on Sunday. In that performance, I tried something different because normally the score is a traditional score with staves and musical notes on it. Musical notes have above them markers. I shouldn't use the word markers. They have above them numbers, which are the numbers of time. So a timeline, and as you go from 0 to the end of the piece, let's say 5 minutes, you follow that timeline and you play the notes when you come to that particular time. What we tried to do in the performance on Sunday was a different system in order to avoid this awareness of what is coming. I created little videos so that each performer has in front of them an iPad, and the screen is blank until such time as it is time to play a note. Then the note, the name of the note appears on the screen, and the performer has to interpret it. Does this work? Does this really disassociate us from that sense of time and sense of anticipation? And the answer, it turns out, is no, because many people came to me afterwards and said, it's a gorgeous piece of chamber music, and I just love the way the flute and the trumpet were interacting with each other. And there is absolutely no interaction between the two of them, at least in a conventional sense. The notes that they each receive on their screen are unsynchronized and unrelated, time-wise. And yet, the audience immediately interprets it as chamber music. So our brains find a connection where there is none. That might be a possible answer to your question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Barrett. The examination shall be continued by Dr. Scott.
Esteemed candidate, thank you very much for this beautiful piece of work. In your discussion of the limitations of reflective imitation, you write, "A dancer or actor will be well schooled in imitation, especially gestural imitation, whereas concert pianists are discouraged from imitation starting at the earliest age. I have had no training in imitation." Given the central, crucial role of imitation in the teaching studio, so listen, watch, repeat, the extent to which definitive recordings already preconfigure our choices, in other words, the ineffable Gouldness of every post-1956 Goldberg variations, and the uniformity of classical pianists' approaches to scores like Beethoven's 111. One could argue that, in fact, classical pianists are virtuosos of imitation, that imitation is fundamental to what we do, and that deep down the knowledge of this explains the shock and horror we feel at the mere suggestion of unoriginality. Looking back, is it possible that you are not learning a new skill, but rather harnessing or redirecting a very old one? Or are there fundamental, irreconcilable differences between the sonic and gestural inputs to imitation?
Zeer geleerde opponents. Imitation is fundamental to what we do. And yet, as pianists, and from here I can only speak from my own personal experience, in a very I was trained in the Russian classical tradition by pianists who were, I would say, extremely anchored in the 19th century and in 19th century teaching techniques. For most of them, recordings were taboo. I was not supposed to be listening to recordings. But the world has changed, and I'd certainly see with my own students that they have a wealth of material available to them. And you mentioned Gould, of course. The thing is that now everybody has that. It's on your phone. And if you want to see Richter's interpretation, Kissim's interpretation, Mahan's interpretation, it's a few clicks away. You don't have to go to a library. You don't have to go hunt for it. You don't have to go find something that might seem far, far away. It's right there. But in my childhood, as a studying pianist, supposedly training for the classical concert stage, that was more or less forbidden, and it was not accessible. I did listen to recordings, and of course I did imitate my teachers. Oddly enough, the teachers I had were not particularly good performers themselves. They wanted me to develop my own interpretation, quote unquote. I do say that in quotations. It's important to say that because in a sense they also wanted me to embody their interpretation. And that was never said, but of course it was expected. And I had a teacher named Galina Belenki, a Russian woman. And for her, it was not about embodying her interpretation because she knew she was not herself a concert pianist. It was all about Emil Gilels. And everything was Gilels. If I did it in Gilels' style, that was the right way to do it. But I was not supposed to go and seek out recordings of Gilels. I didn't hear Gilels play till many, many years later. And, well, of course he was dead. I didn't hear CDs of his. So is imitation fundamental to what we do? I think there is no question, but it is not the same as, for example, dancers who spend their entire lives copying gestures, copying the physicality. We are not supposed to copy the physicality beyond, oh, this is the technique you use, turn your hand like that. No one ever spoke to me about, oh, when you finish the piece, go like this, do nothing, stay, freeze, whatever. Those kind of gestures did not exist, even though they were part of performing tradition already many centuries before I began my own studies. So there is a kind of compartmentalization, I believe, and that might be the answer to your question.
May I just a quick follow-up? I agree partly with what you say, but maybe to just repose the sort of second part of that, which was about whether you think there are real fundamental differences between gesture and sound production in the imitative process. Is there something unique about the way a gesture looks versus how a sound sounds? When you are, whether you're imitating one of these pianists or imitating a teacher or whatever it might be.
Thank you. The question about gesture and sound production is at the heart of the dissertation in the sense that I am talking about the gestures that are part of the sound production, the gestures that are associated with the sound production. And I'm saying that the gestures have an enormous impact on our perception, not in this case of the sounds, I leave that out, but of the silences. And yet, I'm also aware that if you have played and your hands are now off the piano, and I'm going to stick to the piano just to be very specific, your hands are off the piano, you're doing something with them, you are doing some gesture, whether it be this, whether it be this, whatever it might be. It's romantic, it's contemporary, it's modern, it's bizarre, it's strange, it's reserved, it's frightened, it's pulled back, it's introspective. Doesn't matter what those gestures are because you have already released the sounds and the reverberations into the room. What you do at that moment does not change the sound, it only changes the perceptions of the audience. However, there is a bit of a caveat to that because many performers, especially classical ones, conduct themselves. And you'll see that, for example, Trifonov. When he performs, he's constantly, for example, at the beginning of the Beethoven Last Sonata, an example I keep using, but it's a fruitful one. His gestures, he will be performing with one hand, and in the other hand, he is already moving, conducting himself, showing us, the audience, what is happening in terms of the meter and the time, but also conducting for himself. And I believe that the pace, the pacing, the speeds, the pulsations that he chooses actually then shape his own interpretation. So if he chooses to do faster gestures, in a very obvious example, he will go faster. If he's choosing something that's more romantic or something, he will perhaps play in a different way. So it's hard to say, to separate the chicken from the egg, the cause from the effect, which is leading the other. So I don't know if there's an easy answer to that question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Scott. I would like to ask Professor Laws whether she has another question because she seemed to have been cut short a bit. So if you want, you can ask another question or have a longer discussion.
I do. My question is whether you have in your research felt that there is a danger sometimes in employing very theatrical gestures, that you start to feel yourself to be becoming too directive or even didactic in terms of what you might be implying to an audience in how to approach the silences. Does that make sense as a question?
Yes, it does. Too theatrical and too didactic, it's entirely possible. And I bear full responsibility in the sense that the concert I gave on Sunday is about illustrating silence, and hence I went to a lot of trouble to illustrate silence in sometimes very obvious and heightened ways I might not do in the context of a normal performance, which was about something else. If I were focusing on time, I might not be so focused on the extravagance of my gestures, which you saw on Sunday. So can they be too theatrical? Absolutely. On the other hand, it is that theatricality which drew me into this project in the first place. And I've been talking a lot about Beethoven examples, but I would cite here maybe the John Cage examples. The performances of 433 that I highlight, performances mostly from the pandemic, in which people sit or stand in their living rooms or in a small space in front of a camera which is probably placed a little too close to them, and they're kind of awkward and they may not be professionals, and they're doing a performance of John Cage. Quite often they are overemphasizing the theatricality. And that may tie in with trends on social media and TikTok and YouTube and so forth. But that very theatricality has created what I consider to be a new strand or a new genre of cage performances. So I think that there are outlets for that kind of theatricality, even if it may not be entirely appropriate for a classical performance.
Hora est.
Esteemed candidate, the time allotted to the examination of your dissertation and its propositions has passed. The committee withdraws in order to deliberate. I request that you and your company await our return here.